In a small reservation town, where dreams went to die and hope was a luxury few could afford, they thought they had witnessed the cruelest joke life could play. A man born with twisted legs, walking with crutches since childhood, standing at the altar with a bride who couldn't walk at all. The wedding guests whispered behind cupped hands, calling it a union of the broken, a match made in desperation rather than love. They laughed at what they saw as two people settling for what they could get, never imagining they were witnessing the beginning of something extraordinary. What they didn't know was that within the hearts of these two souls burned a fire that would illuminate not just their own lives, but the lives of thousands. What began as mockery would transform into one of the most inspiring love stories ever told. A story of two people who refused to let their physical limitations define their destiny, and who together would reach heights that even those who mocked them could never imagine.
This is not just a love story.
This is a story about the power of seeing beyond what the world tells you is possible, about finding strength in what others perceive as weakness, and about how sometimes the greatest victories come from the most unlikely beginnings. This is the true story of how love, determination, and an unbreakable spirit can lift two people beyond the stars, proving that the only disability in life is a bad attitude and a closed mind. Joseph Running Bear had learned early in life that the world measured a man by what he could do with his legs, not what he carried in his heart. Born on the Maidu reservation in Northern California, with a condition that left his legs twisted and weak, he had spent his childhood watching other boys run through the pine forests, while he struggled to keep up on homemade crutches his grandfather had carved from oak wood. The reservation was a place where dreams often died young, crushed under the weight of poverty, addiction, and the slow erosion of hope that seemed to seep into the red clay soil with each passing generation. Most young people either left as soon as they could, heading to the cities with promises to return that everyone knew were lies, or they stayed and slowly surrendered to the cycle of despair that had claimed their parents and grandparents. But Joseph was different. While his body was limited, his mind soared like the eagles that circled the sacred mountains surrounding their land. He spent hours in the tribal library, a small building that smelled of old books and sage, reading everything he could find about business, technology, and the outside world. His grandmother, a woman whose hands bore the calluses of 7 decades of hard work, would find him there most evenings, his crutches leaning against the wooden table, as he bent over books that transported him far beyond the boundaries of their small community. She would tell him stories of their ancestors, warriors and leaders who had faced impossible odds and emerged victorious. She spoke of times when the Maidu people had been proud and prosperous, when their voices carried weight in the councils of nations. But she also warned him that the world beyond the reservation could be cruel to those who looked different, who walked differently, who carried the burden of being both disabled and Native American in a society that often saw both as signs of weakness. Joseph listened to these warnings, but something deep inside him refused to accept them as his destiny. He had watched his father, a man broken by years of failed attempts to find steady work off the reservation, slowly disappear into a bottle of cheap whiskey. He had seen his older brother succumb to the same fate, despite being blessed with strong legs and a quick mind. Joseph understood that the greatest disability was not physical but mental, the belief that circumstances determined destiny. When he turned 18, Joseph made a decision that shocked everyone in his community. Instead of applying for disability benefits like everyone expected, he enrolled in community college. The journey to the campus required 3 bus transfers and took nearly 2 hours each way, but Joseph made it every single day, his crutches and heavy backpack marking him as different among the sea of young faces who moved easily through the hallways. College was where Joseph first encountered real prejudice. Not the familiar sting of pity he received on the reservation, but the cold indifference of people who saw his disability as an inconvenience, his presence as a reminder of their own mortality and vulnerability. Professors who spoke too quickly, assuming he couldn't keep up. Students who avoided sitting near him, as if disability might be contagious. Staircases in old buildings that forced him to plan his entire day around accessibility. But it was also where he discovered his gift for understanding people and systems. In his business classes, while other students memorized theories and formulas, Joseph saw patterns and connections that others missed. He understood instinctively how to motivate people because he knew what it felt like to need motivation to face each day. He grasped the importance of perseverance because every morning he woke up was a choice to continue fighting. His professors began to notice. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a woman who had built her own business from nothing before returning to teach, took Joseph under her wing. She saw something in his eyes that reminded her of her own hunger when she was starting out. a refusal to accept limitations that others tried to impose. Under her guidance, Joseph began developing business plans that turned traditional thinking on its head, finding opportunities in places where others saw only obstacles. It was during his final year of college that Joseph first heard about Sarah Nighthawk. She was a year younger than him, studying at a different school, but her reputation preceded her throughout the small network of Native American students in their region. Sarah was brilliant, everyone said, destined for great things. She had been valedictorian of her high school class, despite attending a severely underfunded school on the Washoe Reservation in Nevada. She was studying computer science at a time when few women, and even fewer Native American women, entered the field. But then came the accident that changed everything. Sarah had been driving home from college for her younger sister's graduation when a drunk driver ran a red light and slammed into her small car at 60 miles per hour. The impact compressed her spine, leaving her paralyzed from the waist down. In an instant, the young woman who had dreamed of working for major tech companies, who had planned to be the first person in her family to graduate from a 4-year university, found herself learning to navigate the world from a wheelchair. The accident occurred just 3 months before Joseph graduated from community college. He heard about it through the informal network of Native students who shared news, scholarships, and support across the scattered reservations of the West. The story broke his heart, not because of the disability. He understood better than most that life could continue after physical limitations, but because he recognized in Sarah's situation the same crossroads he had faced years earlier. He could imagine her lying in that hospital bed, surrounded by well-meaning relatives who spoke in hushed tones about what a tragedy it was, how her dreams were over, how she would need to adjust her expectations. He could picture the doctors and social workers who meant well, but saw her future only through the lens of limitation. Most painfully, he could envision her facing the same choice he had confronted, whether to accept others' definitions of what was possible or to forge her own path. It took him 3 days to find the right words. Sitting in the tribal library late into the evening, crumpling page after page as he struggled to express thoughts he had never shared with anyone. He didn't want to preach or offer empty encouragement. He wanted to share the truth he had discovered, that the world would try to shrink her dreams to fit their limited vision of what disabled people could accomplish, but that she had the power to refuse that reduction. He told her about his own journey, about the nights when the physical pain from his condition kept him awake, and the emotional pain of others' low expectations cut even deeper. He shared the strategies he had developed for turning obstacles into advantages, for finding strength in places where others expected only weakness. Most importantly, he offered something that was rare in both their communities: understanding without pity, hope without false promises. Sarah was initially skeptical when she received the letter. She was drowning in a sea of sympathy cards and well-meaning advice from people who had no idea what it felt like to suddenly lose the use of half their body. Her own family was struggling with the adjustment, her parents taking turns sleeping in hospital chairs, her siblings unsure how to interact with her now that she was different. The last thing she needed was another stranger offering platitudes about everything happening for a reason. But something in Joseph's letter was different. He didn't tell her that she was special or that God had a plan for her suffering. Instead, he acknowledged that what had happened to her was unfair and devastating, and that she had every right to be angry about it. But he also shared concrete examples of how he had rebuilt his life around his physical limitations. Not by accepting less, but by demanding more from himself and the world around him. They began corresponding regularly, their letters growing longer and more personal as weeks passed. Sarah shared her fears about returning to school, about whether she could still pursue her dreams in computer science, about the way people looked at her now with a mixture of pity and discomfort. Joseph responded with practical advice and emotional support, sharing resources about adaptive technology and introducing her to other disabled professionals who were thriving in their fields. More than that, he helped her understand something crucial, that the accident had not diminished her worth or her potential. It had simply changed the path she would take to reach her goals. Like water finding a way around a stone, she could flow around this obstacle and still reach her destination. Their correspondence evolved into phone calls, long conversations that stretched late into the night as they shared dreams and fears with a honesty that surprised them both. Sarah found herself looking forward to these calls more than anything else in her week. Joseph's voice carried a strength that had nothing to do with physical ability and everything to do with the power of a spirit that refused to be broken. When Sarah finally returned to school, it was with a determination that impressed even her professors. She had to relearn how to navigate campus life, dealing with buildings that weren't fully accessible and attitudes that ranged from overly helpful to subtly dismissive. But she approached each challenge with the methodical problem-solving approach that Joseph had helped her develop. She excelled in her computer science classes, discovering that her analytical mind was actually enhanced by her new perspective on accessibility and adaptive technology. She began developing software solutions for disabled users, filling gaps in the market that she now understood firsthand. Her professors took notice, and by her junior year, she was being recruited by technology companies that were beginning to recognize the value of diverse perspectives in product development. Meanwhile, Joseph had graduated and was working on launching his first business venture, a consulting firm that helped small businesses on reservations develop sustainable economic development plans. The work was challenging and often frustrating, as he encountered the same systemic barriers that had kept native communities in poverty for generations. But he approached each obstacle with the same persistence that had carried him through college and slowly began building a reputation as someone who could find solutions where others saw only problems. It was during a conference on Native American entrepreneurship in Denver that Joseph and Sarah finally met in person. She was there to present her work on accessible technology design, and he was speaking about sustainable economic development in rural communities. They had been corresponding for nearly 2 years, but seeing each other face to face was still a revelation. Sarah was struck by Joseph's presence. Not physical presence, though he moved with a confidence that made his crutches seem like tools rather than limitations. But the way he commanded attention when he spoke, the way people leaned in to hear his ideas, the respect he had earned through his work. Joseph was amazed by Sarah's brilliance and passion, the way she could explain complex technical concepts in terms that anyone could understand, the fire in her eyes when she talked about creating a more inclusive world. They spent hours talking after their respective presentations, sitting in the hotel lobby long after the other conference attendees had gone to bed. They discovered that their individual journeys had been preparing them for something larger, a shared vision of using their experiences and expertise to create opportunities for others who had been written off by society. As their friendship deepened into love, they both understood that they were facing a choice that would define the rest of their lives. They could play it safe, accepting the limitations that others expected of them, building modest lives within the boundaries that society had drawn around disabled people. Or they could dare to dream bigger, to reach for goals that might seem impossible to others but felt achievable when they imagined pursuing them together. The decision to marry was made quietly, without grand gestures or dramatic proposals. It emerged naturally from their shared understanding that they were stronger together than apart, that their combined gifts and perspectives could create something extraordinary. They planned a small ceremony on Joseph's reservation, wanting to honor their heritage and include the communities that had shaped them. But even as they prepared for their wedding, they could sense the whispers and doubts that surrounded them. Family members worried aloud about the practical challenges of two disabled people building a life together. Friends questioned whether they were settling for each other out of convenience rather than genuine love. Community members shook their heads at what they saw as two people with limited options making the best of a difficult situation. The morning of their wedding, as Joseph stood before the mirror in his grandfather's small house, adjusting the bolo tie that had been worn by 3 generations of men in his family, he could hear the murmured conversations outside. Relatives were arriving early, and their words carried clearly through the thin walls. They spoke of low expectations and limited possibilities, of a union born from necessity rather than choice. For a moment, doubt crept into Joseph's mind. Was he being fair to Sarah? Was he asking her to accept a life that was smaller than what she deserved? But then he thought about their conversations, about the dreams they had shared, and the plans they had made together. He remembered the way Sarah's eyes lit up when she talked about the projects they could tackle as a team, the problems they could solve, the barriers they could break down. Sarah was having similar thoughts as her sister helped her with her wedding dress in the small cabin where she was preparing for the ceremony. Through the window, she could see guests gathering under the ancient oak tree where the ceremony would take place, and she could read the skepticism in their expressions. They saw her wheelchair and Joseph's crutches and assumed they understood the whole story. They couldn't imagine that two people with physical disabilities might choose each other, not out of limitation, but out of possibility. As the ceremony began, Joseph stood at the makeshift altar with his best man, his younger cousin, who had been one of the few people to believe in his dreams from the beginning. Sarah approached in her wheelchair, wearing a dress that her grandmother had sewn by hand, her face radiant with a joy that had nothing to do with defying expectations, and everything to do with genuine love and excitement about the future. The tribal elder who performed the ceremony spoke about the traditional Maidu understanding of marriage as a partnership between equals, a joining of gifts and strengths to create something greater than either person could achieve alone. His words were simple but profound, acknowledging that every person brought both abilities and challenges to any relationship, and that true love was about seeing and accepting the whole person. When Joseph and Sarah exchanged vows, their words were not about overcoming disability or proving doubters wrong. They promised to support each other's dreams, to face challenges together, and to never let others' limited vision define what was possible for them. They spoke of building a legacy that would extend far beyond their own lives, of creating opportunities for future generations to dream bigger and reach higher. As they shared their first kiss as husband and wife, the skeptical murmurs from the gathered guests began to fade, replaced by something that looked almost like hope. Perhaps they were witnessing something more than a marriage of convenience after all. Perhaps they were seeing the beginning of something extraordinary. The first year of marriage tested every assumption about what two disabled people could accomplish together. Joseph and Sarah moved into a small apartment in Sacramento, choosing the city because it offered better job opportunities and accessibility than either of their home reservations, but still maintaining close enough ties to their communities to visit regularly. Finding employment proved more challenging than either had anticipated. Despite Joseph's business degree and proven track record in economic development, potential employers seemed fixated on his disability rather than his qualifications. Interview after interview ended with polite rejections and vague explanations about fit and physical demands of positions that clearly required no unusual physical abilities. Sarah faced similar discrimination in the tech industry, where hiring managers questioned whether she could handle the pressure of deadlines and long hours, as if her wheelchair somehow affected her ability to write code or solve complex problems. The couple made a pact during those difficult months never to hide their frustrations from each other, but also never to let setbacks derail their larger goals. They created a routine of sharing both the day's disappointments and discoveries each evening over dinner, treating each rejection as data to analyze rather than a verdict on their worth. This approach served them well when Joseph was turned down for a position with a tribal casino's economic development department after what seemed like a promising series of interviews. Instead of wallowing in disappointment, Joseph used the experience to identify a gap in the market. During his interview process, he had learnt about the complex regulations and cultural sensitivities involved in tribal business development, issues that mainstream consulting firms often struggled to navigate. He realized that his unique background, combining business expertise with authentic understanding of Native American communities and first-hand experience overcoming obstacles, positioned him to serve a market that was being underserved. Sarah encouraged Joseph to pursue this insight, using her technical skills to help him research the market and develop a business plan. Working late into the evenings at their small kitchen table, they mapped out a strategy for launching a consulting firm specializing in sustainable economic development for Native American communities. Sarah's analytical mind proved invaluable in identifying potential clients and developing service offerings, while Joseph's deep understanding of tribal politics and cultural dynamics shaped their approach to marketing and relationship building. The decision to start their own business was both terrifying and liberating. They had no significant savings, no wealthy relatives to provide startup capital, and no network of potential investors. What they did have was an unshakable belief in their vision and a willingness to work harder than anyone thought possible. Joseph formally launched Running Bear Consulting from their spare bedroom, using a folding table as his desk and conducting initial client meetings via phone to avoid the logistical challenges of traveling to distant reservations. Their first client was a small tribe in Oregon that was struggling to develop a tourism plan that would bring in revenue while respecting sacred sites and traditional ways of life. The tribal council had worked with 2 different consulting firms over the previous 3 years, spending thousands of dollars on reports that demonstrated little understanding of their unique cultural considerations and environmental constraints. Joseph's approach was entirely different. Instead of flying in for a few days to gather information and then retreating to an office to write recommendations, he and Sarah spent 2 weeks living on the reservation, attending community meetings, listening to elders' concerns, and learning about the tribe's history and values firsthand. Sarah's technical expertise proved invaluable in developing a comprehensive digital marketing strategy that could showcase the tribe's culture respectfully while attracting visitors genuinely interested in learning rather than simply consuming. The tourism plan they developed was unlike anything the tribal council had seen before. Instead of recommending generic attractions and activities, Joseph and Sarah created a framework for sustainable cultural tourism that would provide income for community members while educating visitors about Native American history and contemporary challenges. Their plan included detailed financial projections, marketing strategies, environmental impact assessments, and cultural preservation protocols. More importantly, their approach empowered the community to control their own narrative, rather than having outsiders dictate how their culture should be presented to tourists. Tribal members would be trained as guides and storytellers, sharing their own experiences and perspectives. Sarah designed a user-friendly website that would allow the tribe to update content and manage bookings independently, reducing their reliance on expensive external contractors. The success of this first project led to referrals from other tribal communities facing similar challenges. Word spread through the informal networks that connected Native American leaders across the western United States that there was a consulting firm that actually understood their unique needs and constraints. Joseph's reputation grew as someone who could navigate the complex intersection of federal regulations, tribal sovereignty, cultural sensitivity, and economic reality. As Running Bear Consulting expanded, Sarah launched her own technology ventures. She had identified significant gaps in the accessibility software market, particularly for products designed to serve Native American communities and other marginalized populations. Many existing assistive technologies were expensive, difficult to customize, and designed with urban middle-class users in mind, rather than people living in rural areas with limited internet access and older computing equipment. Sarah's first major project was developing a suite of educational software applications designed specifically for tribal schools and community colleges. These programs incorporated traditional teaching methods and cultural references while meeting state and federal educational standards. Her background in both computer science and the lived experience of navigating educational systems with a disability gave her unique insights into how technology could be designed to include, rather than exclude. The software Sarah developed was revolutionary in its simplicity and cultural relevance. Instead of generic math problems, her applications used scenarios involving traditional crafts, land management, and community economics. Students learned programming concepts by creating digital art that incorporated tribal symbols and stories. Most importantly, all of her applications were designed to be fully accessible to students with various disabilities, something that was virtually non-existent in educational software at the time. Educational institutions began reaching out to Sarah after seeing demonstrations of her work at conferences and through word-of-mouth recommendations from teachers who were struggling to engage Native American students with traditional curriculums. Her company, Nighthawk Technologies, grew from a one-person operation working out of the spare bedroom to a small team of programmers and educational consultants. The success of both businesses allowed Joseph and Sarah to move into a larger home and begin thinking about expanding their impact beyond individual client relationships. They had learned through their work that many of the challenges facing Native American communities were systemic, requiring policy changes and large-scale initiatives rather than individual consulting projects. They began developing plans for a foundation that would address these broader issues while supporting other Native American entrepreneurs and professionals. However, their growing success also attracted new forms of discrimination and skepticism. Competitors began spreading rumors that Running Bear Consulting was succeeding only because of preferential treatment for minority-owned businesses, ignoring the quality and innovation that distinguished their work. Some questioned whether Joseph and Sarah were authentic enough to represent Native American interests, since their education and business success seemed to distance them from the poverty and dysfunction that outsiders typically associated with reservation life. More painful were the criticisms that came from within their own communities. Some tribal members viewed their success with suspicion, wondering whether Joseph and Sarah had sold out to mainstream American culture in pursuit of profit. Others resented their visibility and influence, feeling that two disabled people shouldn't be representing the capabilities of Native American communities to the outside world. Joseph and Sarah addressed these criticisms head-on, using them as opportunities to engage in deeper conversations about identity, success, and representation. They made it clear that their goal was not to distance themselves from their communities, but to create pathways for others to follow. Every project they took on included training and mentorship components designed to build local capacity rather than creating dependency on outside expertise. They also began speaking publicly about the intersection of disability and Native American identity, challenging audiences to examine their own assumptions about both communities. Joseph's presentations at business conferences were powerful, not because he downplayed his disability, but because he demonstrated how his unique perspective had actually enhanced his ability to understand and solve complex problems. Sarah's technical presentation showed how her experience with accessibility issues had made her a better programmer and designer for all users, not just those with disabilities. Their marriage deepened during this period of professional growth, strengthened by the daily experience of pursuing shared goals and supporting each other through challenges that would have overwhelmed either of them individually. They developed a rhythm of collaboration that maximized their complementary strengths while compensating for each other's limitations. Joseph's intuitive understanding of people and politics balanced Sarah's analytical and technical approach to problem solving. Sarah's attention to detail and systematic thinking supported Joseph's big-picture vision and relationship-building skills. Friends and colleagues began referring to them as a single entity, Joseph and Sarah, recognizing that their partnership had created something greater than the sum of its parts. They made major decisions together, consulted each other on all significant projects, and maintained a unified vision even when approaching problems from different angles. This collaborative approach extended to their personal lives as well. They had designed their home to accommodate both of their mobility needs while serving as a comfortable space for hosting community meetings and business gatherings. Their living room featured a large accessible table where they could spread out documents and drawings, transforming their home into an informal headquarters for various projects and initiatives. By their third anniversary, Joseph and Sarah had achieved a level of professional success that exceeded the wildest dreams of many of the people who had attended their wedding. Running Bear Consulting had completed projects for more than 20 tribal communities across 7 states, generating millions of dollars in economic development and creating hundreds of jobs. Nighthawk Technologies was being recognized as an innovator in accessible educational software, with products being used in schools and community centers across Indian country. More importantly, they had begun to change perceptions about what disabled Native Americans could accomplish. Young people from their home communities were reaching out for mentorship and advice, seeing in Joseph and Sarah's example proof that physical limitations didn't have to define life possibilities. Parents were encouraging children with disabilities to pursue higher education and professional careers, using Joseph and Sarah as examples of what determination and proper support could achieve. The foundation they had been planning began to take concrete shape during their 4th year of marriage. They envisioned an organization that would provide scholarships for disabled Native American students, support for tribal entrepreneurs, and advocacy for policy changes that would remove barriers to economic development in Indian country. The foundation would also fund research into the intersection of disability and Native American identity, filling gaps in academic understanding while providing practical guidance for families and communities. Fundraising for the foundation required Joseph and Sarah to become more public figures than they had originally intended. They began accepting speaking engagements at universities, conferences, and policy forums, sharing their story not as inspiration, but as evidence of what became possible when systemic barriers were addressed and individual potential was properly supported. Their presentations challenged audiences to think differently about both disability and Native American identity. Joseph would begin by acknowledging the reality of discrimination and limited opportunities, then demonstrate through concrete examples how changing systems and attitudes could unlock potential that was always present but often unrecognized. Sarah would follow by showing how inclusive design and accessible technology could benefit entire communities, not just those with obvious disabilities. These speaking engagements also allowed them to build relationships with potential donors and partners who shared their vision of systemic change. They attracted support from foundations focused on disability rights, organizations working on Native American issues, and technology companies interested in expanding their market reach to underserved communities. The response to their public advocacy was overwhelmingly positive, but it also attracted new challenges. They began receiving hate mail from people who objected to successful Native Americans challenging stereotypes about their communities. Some messages focused on their disabilities, suggesting that they were poor representatives for their people because they were broken or damaged.
Others questioned their right to speak for Native American communities, arguing that their education and success had removed them from the authentic experience of reservation life.
Joseph and Sarah decided to address these criticisms directly in their presentations and writings, using them as opportunities to educate audiences about the complex realities of contemporary Native American life.
They explained that Native American communities were diverse and multifaceted, including people with various educational backgrounds, economic circumstances, and life experiences. They argued that authentic representation required including all voices within their communities, not just those that confirmed outsiders' expectations. Their 4th wedding anniversary fell during the same week that they received final approval for their foundation's tax-exempt status, marking a major milestone in their journey from newlyweds facing skepticism to established leaders in their respective fields. They celebrated quietly, spending the evening reviewing applications for the foundation's first round of scholarships and discussing their goals for the coming year. The applications they reviewed told stories that were both heartbreaking and inspiring. Young Native Americans with various disabilities were applying for support to pursue degrees in fields ranging from law to medicine to engineering. Many were the first in their families to attend college, facing not only the usual challenges of higher education, but also the additional obstacles created by disability and cultural dislocation. Reading these applications reminded Joseph and Sarah of their own struggles and the people who had believed in them when others saw only limitations. They were now in a position to provide that same support to the next generation, helping to create a pipeline of disabled Native American professionals who could continue the work they had started. 5 years after their wedding, Joseph and Sarah received an invitation that would have seemed impossible during those early days when people whispered about their marriage of convenience. The White House was hosting a summit on disability rights and economic inclusion, and they had been selected as featured speakers representing the intersection of disability advocacy and minority business development. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered to their Sacramento office where Running Bear Consulting now employed 12 people, and Nighthawk Technologies had a staff of 8. Sarah was reviewing code for a new accessibility application when Joseph burst into her office, waving the official envelope with the presidential seal. For a moment, they both stared at the invitation in silence, remembering the relatives who had shaken their heads at their wedding and the employers who had dismissed them without consideration. Preparing for their White House presentation required weeks of careful planning. They would be addressing an audience that included federal policymakers, disability rights advocates, business leaders, and representatives from various minority communities. Their goal was not simply to tell their personal story, but to present a comprehensive framework for understanding how multiple forms of discrimination intersected and how policy solutions could address systemic barriers rather than individual symptoms. Joseph focused his remarks on the economic impact of exclusion, presenting data that Running Bear Consulting had compiled over years of working with tribal communities. He demonstrated how discrimination against disabled Native Americans represented not just a moral failing, but an economic waste, preventing communities from utilizing the full range of available human talent. His presentation included case studies showing how inclusive economic development strategies had generated measurable improvements in tribal prosperity. Sarah's presentation addressed the technology gap that prevented many disabled people, particularly those in rural and minority communities, from accessing tools that could enhance their independence and productivity. She unveiled a new initiative that Nighthawk Technologies was launching in partnership with several tribal colleges, a program to train disabled Native Americans as technology specialists who could serve their own communities while building careers in the growing tech sector. The response to their presentations exceeded their expectations. Policymakers who had previously viewed disability issues and tribal economic development as separate challenges began to understand how addressing them together could create more effective solutions. Business leaders expressed interest in partnering with their organizations to develop new markets and product lines. Most importantly, other advocates began reaching out to discuss collaborative approaches to systemic change. The White House Summit marked a turning point in Joseph and Sarah's influence, elevating them from successful entrepreneurs to national thought leaders. Interview requests poured in from media outlets that wanted to understand how two people who had faced such significant obstacles had managed to build not just successful businesses, but a platform for broader social change. They approached this newfound visibility strategically, using each media appearance to advance specific policy goals rather than simply sharing their personal story. Joseph would highlight the need for improved infrastructure and educational opportunities on reservations, while Sarah would advocate for stronger accessibility requirements in technology development. Together, they challenged audiences to move beyond inspiration and toward concrete action. Their foundation's first scholarship recipients were beginning to graduate from college and professional schools, creating a new generation of disabled Native American leaders in fields ranging from healthcare to law to engineering. These young professionals stayed connected to the foundation, serving as mentors for newer scholarship recipients and as advocates for continued systemic change within their chosen fields. Maria Clearwater, a Lakota woman who had been paralyzed in a skiing accident during her sophomore year of college, became the first disabled Native American to graduate from Harvard Medical School. She credited the Foundation's scholarship and mentorship program with helping her navigate both the academic challenges and the cultural isolation she experienced as one of the few Native American students in her program. David Thunderhorse, born with cerebral palsy on the Navajo Nation, used Foundation support to pursue a law degree and establish a practice specializing in disability rights and tribal law. His work was already breaking new ground in cases involving the intersection of federal disability protection and tribal sovereignty, creating legal precedents that would benefit both communities for generations. These success stories validated Joseph and Sarah's belief that systemic change was possible, but they also highlighted the enormous scope of work that remained. For every scholarship recipient who thrived, dozens of other qualified candidates had to be turned away due to limited funding. For every tribal community that successfully implemented inclusive economic development strategies, many others continued to struggle with poverty and limited opportunities. The couple decided to expand their impact by creating a comprehensive training program that would prepare other consultants and advocates to replicate their work in communities they couldn't serve directly. The curriculum they developed combined technical skills with cultural competency and disability awareness, ensuring that participants could work effectively with diverse populations while maintaining the quality standards that had made their own organizations successful. The training program launched with pilot sessions in 5 different regions, each tailored to the specific needs and cultural contexts of local communities. Participants included social workers, tribal government employees, small business owners, and recent college graduates who wanted to pursue careers in community development. The diversity of backgrounds created rich learning environments where participants could share different perspectives while working toward common goals. Sarah simultaneously expanded Nighthawk technologies into new areas, developing assistive technology solutions for elderly Native Americans who were aging in place on rural reservations. This demographic faced unique challenges, including limited access to healthcare technology and cultural preferences for remaining in their home communities rather than moving to urban assisted living facilities. The products Sarah's team developed addressed these specific needs, while incorporating traditional cultural elements that made the technology more acceptable to users who were often skeptical of modern devices. Voice recognition software was programmed to understand tribal languages and dialects. Emergency response systems connected users to local community networks rather than distant call centers. Educational applications help preserve tribal languages and stories while providing practical health and safety information. These innovations attracted attention from technology companies and healthcare organizations that were beginning to recognize the size and potential of the Native American market. Sarah found herself consulting with major corporations about inclusive design principles, helping them understand how creating products for marginalized communities could actually expand their overall market reach while serving important social goals. Joseph's work also evolved toward larger systemic challenges. Running Bear Consulting began taking on projects that involved multiple tribal communities working together to address regional economic development opportunities. These collaborations required sophisticated coordination and cultural sensitivity, as different tribes had different priorities, resources, and relationships with federal and state governments. One of their most ambitious projects involved 5 tribal communities in the Pacific Northwest collaborating to develop a sustainable tourism corridor that would showcase the region's cultural and natural heritage while providing economic opportunities for all participating communities. The project required Joseph to navigate complex political relationships while maintaining focus on shared economic goals. The tourism corridor became a model for intertribal collaboration, generating millions of dollars in revenue while preserving sacred sites and traditional practices. More importantly, it demonstrated that tribal communities could work together effectively when they had proper facilitation and shared economic incentives. Success brought new challenges and responsibilities. Joseph and Sarah found themselves being asked to weigh in on federal policy debates, serve on corporate advisory boards, and provide expert testimony in legal cases involving disability rights and tribal sovereignty. These opportunities to influence systemic change were exactly what they had hoped to achieve, but they also required careful balance between their advocacy goals and their business responsibilities. They established clear guidelines for their public advocacy, ensuring that their positions were always consistent with their core values while avoiding unnecessary controversy that might undermine their effectiveness. They refused to endorse political candidates but actively advocated for specific policy positions. They accepted corporate board positions only when they could meaningfully influence company policies toward greater inclusion and accessibility. Their marriage remained the foundation that supported all their other work, but it also evolved as they adapted to increasing public visibility and professional demands. They learned to create protected time for their relationship despite busy travel schedules and constant requests for their attention. They maintained their practice of daily check-ins and joint decision-making, even when physical distance required phone or video conversations. They also made a conscious decision to have children, despite concerns from some relatives and friends about the challenges of parenting with disabilities. Their daughter, Elena Running Bear Nighthawk, was born during their 7th year of marriage, bringing new joy and motivation to their work while challenging them to think about the kind of world they wanted to leave for the next generation. Elena's birth also prompted Joseph and Sarah to reflect on how their own experiences could inform their parenting. They were determined to raise her with an understanding of her cultural heritage and a commitment to social justice, while also ensuring that she had opportunities to develop her own interests and identity separate from their public roles. As Elena grew from infant to toddler, she became a regular presence at foundation events and community meetings, where she charmed audiences while normalizing the presence of disabled parents in professional settings. Joseph would conduct client meetings while Elena played in her portable crib nearby, and Sarah often participated in video conferences while Elena napped in her lap. Their 10th wedding anniversary fell during the same month that Joseph received a Presidential Medal of Freedom for his contributions to economic development and disability advocacy. The ceremony took place in the same White House where they had spoken at the Disability Summit 5 years earlier, but this time they were being honored for the lasting impact of their work, rather than simply presenting their ideas. Standing in the Rose Garden as the president placed the medal around his neck, Joseph thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. He remembered the tribal elder who had performed their wedding ceremony, speaking about the traditional understanding of marriage as a partnership that created something greater than either person could achieve alone. He thought about the whispered conversations at their wedding reception, the doubts and low expectations that had surrounded their union. Most powerfully, he remembered Sarah in her wedding dress, approaching the altar with a radiance that had nothing to do with proving anyone wrong, and everything to do with genuine excitement about their shared future. She had been right to be excited, he realized. Together, they had built something extraordinary. The speech Joseph delivered at the medal ceremony focused not on his individual achievements, but on the collaborative nature of all meaningful social change. He thanked Sarah, their families, their employees, and the communities that had supported their work. He acknowledged the scholarship recipients, mentees, and partners who had amplified their impact far beyond what they could have achieved alone. But he also challenged the audience to understand that his story was not unique or impossible to replicate. Across the country, he argued, there were thousands of disabled people from marginalized communities who possessed similar talent and determination, but lacked access to the opportunities and support systems that had made his success possible. The real work was not celebrating individual achievements, but creating systems that would allow more people to reach their potential. Sarah watched from the audience, holding Elena in her lap as their toddler waved enthusiastically at her father on the podium. She thought about the young woman she had been 10 years earlier, lying in a hospital bed and wondering whether her dreams were over. She remembered the letter from Joseph that had helped her understand that her accident had not ended her story, but simply changed the path it would take. Now, as she looked around the Rose Garden at the assembled crowd of dignitaries and activists, she could see concrete evidence of the impact they had created together. Several of their scholarship recipients were in attendance, now established professionals in their own right. Corporate executives who had implemented inclusive policies after consulting with their organizations sat alongside disability advocates whose work had been supported by their foundation. Their success had rippled outward in ways they could never have imagined during those early years when they were struggling to find their first clients and donors. But Sarah understood that the most important measure of their impact was not the awards or recognition they had received. It was the transformation they had witnessed in young people who now believed that disability and minority status could be sources of strength rather than limitation. The evening after the medal ceremony, Joseph and Sarah hosted a reception at their hotel for the scholarship recipients, mentees, and community partners who had traveled to Washington to attend the event. The conversation was lively and optimistic, filled with reports of new initiatives, successful projects, and expanding opportunities. Elena, now old enough to understand that her parents were being honored for something important, moved through the crowd collecting congratulations and treats from the assembled guests. Joseph and Sarah watched her interaction with their extended community of advocates and allies, struck by how natural it seemed to her to be surrounded by people with various disabilities and from different cultural backgrounds. This was the world they had created for their daughter, they realized. Not a world without challenges or discrimination, but one where diversity was valued, where different kinds of minds and bodies were seen as resources rather than problems, where young people could dream beyond the limitations that previous generations had accepted as inevitable. As the reception wound down and guests began saying their goodbyes, Joseph and Sarah found themselves standing together on the hotel balcony, looking out over the lights of the nation's capital. Elena had fallen asleep in her stroller, exhausted by the excitement of the day. 10 years earlier, they had stood together at their wedding reception, listening to the whispered doubts of relatives who couldn't imagine what two disabled people might build together. Tonight, they could look back on a decade of achievements that exceeded even their own ambitious dreams. But more importantly, they could look forward to a future filled with new possibilities for the communities they served and the daughter they were raising. They had proven that love, determination, and an unbreakable spirit could indeed lift two people beyond the stars. But they had also proven something even more important, that individual success was meaningful only when it created pathways for others to follow. Their story was not just about overcoming personal obstacles, but about transforming the systems that created those obstacles for others. As they watched Elena sleep peacefully in her stroller, surrounded by the evidence of everything they had built together, Joseph and Sarah understood that their greatest achievement was not any specific project or recognition they had received. It was the fact that the world their daughter was growing up in was fundamentally different from the one they had inherited, expanded by the possibilities they had dared to pursue when others saw only limitations. The stars above Washington seemed brighter that night, a reminder that human potential, like the universe itself, was vast and largely unexplored. There was still so much work to be done, so many barriers to dismantle, so many young people who needed to see that their dreams were achievable. But Joseph and Sarah had proven that it was possible to reach beyond the expectations that others set, to build something extraordinary from circumstances that looked limiting, to transform not just their own lives, but the lives of countless others who would follow in their path. They had kept the promise they made to each other on their wedding day, to never let others' limited vision define what was possible for them. In doing so, they had expanded the vision of possibility for everyone who came after them,